The first trace is not a name, but a price. August, 1,851 ink bleeding through cheap ledger paper. A trader's cramped hand noting one specimen, age 19, purchased Charleston Market. Exceptional characteristics. R. Babai Sushiti. No explanation for the extraordinary sum. Only a flourish beside the buyer's name, Thomas Rutland of Belmont. Entries before and after are ordinary boys listed by height and scars. Women tallied by teeth and childbearing, yet this line glows like a coal in wet ash. Later, when neighbors would whisper and county clerks would misplace entire boxes of files, that figure would remain in memory. Money has a way of leaving fingerprints, even when men try to wash the rest away. Southside Virginia, in late summer, carries a heaviness that walks on its own legs. Fields of tobacco bow under their own bitterness. The air smells of molasses and tar, and the eaves of the big houses drip with humming heat. Dirt roads bake, then break into red paste with a sudden shower. Between the oak and the pine, there are houses, many columns and many rooms, and behind them, in tidy rows, the narrow doors of cabins facing each other like opposing mirrors. Belmont sat on the eastern lip of Prince Edward County, a Georgian brick pile with black shutters and sober pride. It was not the grandest estate, only the most certain of its right to exist. 42 enslaved laborers moved its breath in and out. The master said when morning began and when night was allowed to arrive. Thomas Rutland was 37. A man bred to seem inevitable, he carried his chin as if he had inherited the posture along with the land. 7 years before, Belmont and its debts had dropped onto his shoulders. He had paid down the numbers with the precise cruelty of a man who believes cruelty is a kind of bookkeeping. People called him efficient, which meant predictable. They called him not unkind, which means his punishment seldom made stories. The county liked men like Thomas because men like Thomas kept the machine oiled. Catherine, 10 years younger, had come with a dowry that melted several creditors into smiles. Richmond had given her a merchant father, fashionable gowns, and a face that looked better in candlelight than at noon. In 1849, she delivered a son who never learned his name. After that, the windows upstairs became her closest friends. Even in summer, she wrapped herself in shawls. She read French novels for their tragic parts. When other women laughed too loudly at suppers, Catherine would press her lips together as if she were trying to hold in smoke. On the 14th of August, the trader came, Samuel Wickham, in a black coat that always looked a day from its last day. He had hawk eyes and a habit of standing too near, as if distance itself were a resource he meant to exploit. He called what he sold specialty acquisitions, and the phrase hung in the room like a perfume with something rotten beneath it. In the plantation office, a detached brick room where Thomas kept receipts and thin cigars, Wickham drank a polite finger of whiskey and spoke about markets. Congressmen, future wars no one was willing to name. Then he leaned forward, conversational tone turning surgical. I have, Mr. Rutland, an item that may interest a gentleman who appreciates the uncommon. He said, house-raised, literate, formerly in a physician's custody. The rarity, however, is anatomical. Thomas had the misfortune of intelligence without imagination. He could appraise a roofline at a glance and never ask what weather felt like under it. The word Wickham placed on the table, Hermaphrodite, entered his mind like a puzzle that promised to solve a larger puzzle he could not name. Something shifted behind his ribs, curiosity with a wide, hungry mouth. He insisted on seeing the specimen. Wickham had anticipated this, and so a wagon waited already in the yard. 20 minutes later, the office door opened, and a figure stepped into the square of hot light. The person's posture was the posture. All property wears hands gently folded, chin tilted downward, eyes not quite meeting anything. The cotton shift told Thomas very little. What it failed to hide told him too much. Face fine as porcelain but alive, jaw soft without being delicate, the hands narrow, uncalloused, the feet arched like a dancer's, air-crop clothes. It was the voice that crowned the strangeness when Wickham said, "Introduce yourself." "My name is Jordan." "Master, I'm 19. I read, I write, and I cipher. I submit to examination without resistance. I obey. Each word carried an accentless clarity, pitched not between, but beyond two registers, neither borrowing nor apologizing. Rehearsed language delivered by a mind clearly aware it was being listened to for the evidence of a body. Thomas did not know he had moved closer until he felt his breath come back at a shorter length. Wickham spoke numbers as if they were benedictions, and the number on the page looked suddenly reasonable against the scale of what Thomas wanted from the world and could not name. He accepted. The ink dried, money changed hands, and something colder than coin slid into the room to sit cross-legged on the floor. He did not send Jordan to the quarters. He took the key to a small cottage near the formal garden, a valet's house empty since his father's day, and opened its door to dust and a single iron bed. "You will stay here," he said, as if he were talking to a problem he intended to contemplate. "I will determine your duties." Jordan's face did not move. "Yes, master." At dinner, Thomas said house servant with unusual training. He told Catherine the previous owner had been a physician, that the slave could be useful with medicines and linen. He described uncommon characteristics with a stiffness that betrayed the tremor underneath. Catherine set down her knife. "What kind of uncommon?" she asked. He hesitated, then deferred. "Perhaps you should see for yourself." Morning put its pale hand on the cottage window. In the doorway, Catherine looked at Jordan the way a river looks at a broken bridge, curious first, then implicated. She circled without touching, taking in the undecidable lines of the face. The way bearing could tilt the body toward one understanding, and then back again with a shift of weight. Thomas, pretending to be clinical, explained. The word he had not said at supper now sat in the room and refused to leave. Catherine's expression did not soften so much as reorganize, grief draining into fascination, hunger reforming as inquiry. "May I?" she began, and did not finish the grammar. Thomas said yes because he did not know how to say no to the shape his mind had taken. What followed was decorous, controlled, performed in the bright, cruel light of day, and nonetheless, it trespassed beyond language. Catherine asked questions about the physician's notes Wickham had supplied. She studied hands, collarbones, the steady rise and fall of Jordan's chest. What began in the tone of a nurse ended in the hush of a chapel that has forgotten its God. That night, for the first time in months, Thomas and Catherine reached for each other and mistook nearness for absolution. They did not speak about the cottage. The silence felt like a wrapped gift they both agreed not to open. Outside, summer insects fretted the dark to pieces. In the days after, the plantation maintained its outward grammar, the bell at dawn, the measured steps to field and barn. The inventory performed as liturgy, yet something uncountable tilted. Thomas's strides shortened, his gaze, once sweeping, he became narrow and exacting. He sent for books. He had no right to understand dissections in copperplate and case histories written in a physician's confident hand. He began to write his own notes at night. Lines of observation that pretended to be science but were only appetite assigned Latin. Catherine found reasons to cross the garden at odd hours. She returned with a faint flush that made the maids glance away out of a respect so deep it looked like fear. The enslaved people on the place noticed the drift of gravity toward the little house. They spoke in the language of survival, low and literal, naming only what could be safely named. Harriet, the cook, kept her counsel and watched the master's mouth when he gave orders, as if the lips themselves might reveal where and how the world would break. Jordan, installed at the edge of everything, learned the pathways of Belmont, the way rain learns a roofline. Their face became unreadable, not from emptiness, but from practice. They answered when called, and were not called by their name when an object would do. They understood their condition had been a lesson taught to other men's eyes, long before they learned any letters. And still, the mind behind those eyes noted each small failing the master's papers left unopened. The mistress's plate, returning to the kitchen, barely touched. A crack in a parlor mirror, shaped like a black vein. One evening, as the sun broke behind thunderclouds and turned the lawn to copper, Wickham's wagon was already 2 counties away, and the ledger line was already changing shape into a rumour. At Belmont, a man and a woman lay awake in the same bed, pretending the closeness had cured something. In the cottage, the person who had cost more than anyone there had ever cost sat upright in a narrow bed and watched moths throw themselves against glass. There is a kind of silence that is not an absence of sound but the presence of something waiting. Belmont heard it in the hinges. The fields heard it in the way the soil held the day's heat too long. Harriet heard it in the spaces between footsteps. It announced itself without speaking. This house had accepted a guest that could not be seated at any table. By the time dawn pulled its first thread through the pines, the shape of the days ahead was fixed. Thomas would move Jordan from the cottage to a room under his own roof. Explaining it as efficiency, Catherine would stand at a window and ask herself if the ache in her chest was grief, désir, or simply the feeling of running out of names. The people in the quarters would lower their voices when the big house door opened. And somewhere, already, the room that would one day be sealed was choosing its corner and memorizing the floorboards. The ledger's number remained, but the accounting had changed. What Thomas purchased was not a body, it was a mirror. What Catherine touched was not an answer, it was the hole the answer had left. Belmont kept breathing, but the breath did not satisfy. The story had begun to write itself in the only ink it trusted, the kind that stains. Morning light in Southside comes slowly, as if it must be coaxed into existence. Mist drifts between the trees like breath, too weary to rise, and the world smells faintly of smoke and iron. On such mornings, the Belmont estate looks almost innocent, red brick washed pale, white columns softened by dew. But inside, something restless has begun to stir. Thomas has spent the night in his study, surrounded by ledgers he no longer reads. The candle guttered hours ago, but he hasn't noticed. His fingers trace the same line on a page, the notation of Jordan's purchase, until the ink smudges into shadow. Upstairs, Catherine lies awake in her room, the faint hum of cicadas leaking through the shutters. Between them, silence stretches, taut and invisible as wire. By mid-morning, Thomas gives the order. Jordan is to be brought from the cottage to the main house. Officially, it is for convenience. The explanation satisfies no one, least of all himself. The enslaved servants exchange glances as they carry bedding and water up the back staircase to a narrow room on the 3rd floor, a space once used for visiting tutors and governesses, a space too close to the mistress's chamber to make sense. When Catherine sees the arrangement, her lips part as if to object but then close again. "It will be easier," she says, finally, and her voice carries the weight of someone who has already begun to surrender. Jordan enters the new room with the same careful stillness that has become their armor. The light from the single window catches on the fine curve of their jaw, on the ambiguity that seems to shift with every breath. Catherine stands in the doorway, one hand resting lightly on the frame. Her husband waits behind her, saying nothing. For a long moment, none of them move. Then Catherine crosses the room and touches the back of the chair, not Jordan. Not yet, but close enough that the space between skin and air feels charged. "You'll attend to me directly," she says. "Dressing, correspondence, whatever I require. Is that clear?" "Yes." "Mistress." "Good." But she doesn't leave. Neither does Thomas. The air itself seems to hesitate. That afternoon, Catherine summons Jordan to her sitting room. The heat has grown oppressive. Even the glass in the windows looks swollen. A bowl of wilted roses sits on the table, their scent thick and faintly sweet with decay. Catherine is reading, though her eyes have not moved across the page in minutes. When Jordan enters, she gestures absently toward the mirror. "Help me with my hair." The command is ordinary, but her tone is not. Jordan steps forward, taking up the brush. The sound of bristles through hair fills the silence, steady, rhythmic, almost hypnotic. Catherine watches their reflection, the face neither fully male nor female, the eyes dark and steady, the mouth expressionless. "How do you see yourself?" she asks suddenly. Jordan pauses. "I don't understand." "Mistress." "I think you do." Jordan lowers their gaze. "I see what others see." It changes. Catherine's eyes narrow. searching the mirror as if it might offer its own opinion. "And what do I see?" Jordan answers with disarming calm. "Whatever you need to." For a moment, Catherine forgets to breathe. The reply lands like a confession and an accusation at once. Downstairs, the household continues its slow machinery. The overseer's voice drifts from the fields, distant but sharp. Harriet, in the kitchen, kneads bread with more force than necessary, her mind turning over things she will never dare to say aloud. She has seen masters lose themselves before drink. Money, grief, but this is something else. She feels it in the walls. In the way sound carries differently through the house. The rhythm of Belmont has changed its tempo. That night, Catherine sits at her vanity, staring into the mirror until her reflection blurs. Thomas stands behind her, watching the hollow curve of her shoulders, the pale nape of her neck. "You're spending a great deal of time with the new servant," he says. Is that jealousy? Her voice is almost playful, but the smile doesn't reach her eyes. "I'm not sure what it is." Then perhaps we share the same confusion. He wants to say something that will pull them both back to solid ground, but language feels inadequate. Childish. Catherine rises. Her movements deliberate, almost ceremonial. "You brought this into our home, Thomas," she says softly, "and now you pretend to be shocked that it breathes the same air." He does not answer. They stand so close that the heat between them becomes its own presence. Then, as if guided by an unseen hand, they move toward each other, not with tenderness, but with the hunger of people who have mistaken possession for salvation. Days slide into weeks. The house rearranges itself around this new gravity. Jordan attends to the mistress, brings water, brushes fabric, moves silently between rooms. The other slaves avoid the third-floor corridor when possible. Even the dogs refuse to linger there. Harriet watches from the kitchen window one afternoon as Thomas crosses the garden toward the main house. His pace is quick, almost furtive. Moments later, Catherine's silhouette appears briefly behind the curtains upstairs. The cook shakes her head and mutters, "Nothing good ever came from curiosity the Lord didn't grant." That night, thunder mutters far off over the hills. The air smells like iron and waiting. Inside, Catherine cannot sleep. She sits by the window, the stormlight turning her profile to marble. Jordan kneels by the hearth, adjusting the fire. It will rain soon. Catherine says, "Yes, mistress. Do you ever miss where you came from? I was born in a house, not the fields. The places change. The rules don't. And what rules are those? To be what is needed. To become whatever quiet keeps me alive." Catherine studies the younger person, the fluid grace of movement that defies her understanding. Something inside her envy, pity, longing. She cannot tell twists like a knot. "You speak as if you don't belong to the world at all." Jordan looks up, and for an instant the mask slips. "Perhaps I don't." Catherine feels her throat tighten. She stands abruptly and moves toward the door, but before leaving she says, almost to herself, "Then maybe that's what makes you free." Jordan watches her go, the words lingering in the air like a scent that refuses to fade. By harvest time, the rumors have begun to move through the quarters. They speak of a slave in the big house who never sweats, who sleeps in silk, whose body confuses even the master and mistress. Some whisper that Jordan carries both spirits, male and female, and that such a creature can undo the order of any home that dares to contain it. Others think it's simple madness, but all agree something unnatural has entered Belmont. In the evenings, after the fields fall silent, Harriet sits with her sister Delia outside the kitchen door. The crickets sing, and the air hums with heat even after dark. "You ever seen the master's face lately?" Delia asks. "Looks like he ain't been sleeping in weeks." Harriet nods. "He's sick in the soul. Both of them are. That new one brought it with them." Delia crosses herself. "You mean cursed. I mean cursed, or cursing it, don't much matter which." Above them, on the third floor, a lamp burns long past midnight. Inside, Catherine sits reading a medical text she cannot understand. while Thomas paces the hallway outside. Between them, behind a thin wooden door, Jordan lies awake, listening to every creak, every whisper of footsteps, knowing the real storm has only just begun. The morning after the storm, Belmont smelled of damp earth and scorched tobacco, a strange mix of growth and rot. In the fields, men stooped beneath the weight of wet leaves, their movements slow and deliberate. In the big house, the air was no less heavy. The rain had not cooled anything, it had only driven the heat inward. On that morning, Jordan was moved permanently into the third-floor room beside Catherine's. No one announced the change, but everyone noticed. The enslaved workers exchanged glances they dared not voice. A person in service to the mistress might live near her. Yes, but not there. Behind that particular door, the one no maid entered without being called, Harriet watched the move from the kitchen window. She had seen many things in 20 years of Belmont the births. The punishments, the silences after, but this was different. The new slave carried no trunk, no possessions, only a small wooden box tucked beneath one arm. The master himself unlocked the door. Harriet saw how Catherine lingered nearby, hands clasped tightly before her, as if to hold herself in one piece. From that day forward, the house developed a new rhythm. It wasn't visible on the surface. Guests who came for Sunday supper or county business saw only courtesy and refinement. But beneath that thin veneer, something warped. Catherine no longer sat at the piano after dinner. Thomas no longer discussed crop yields or accounts. They spoke to each other less and less, except when Jordan was present. The first to sense the full wrongness was Harriet. She heard it, not in words, but in the silences between them. The house had its own language, the creak of steps, the clatter of dishes, the echo of voices through the hall. And lately, that language had changed. She would hear the master's boots on the stairs late at night, soft and hesitant, followed by the faint click of a latch on the third floor. Sometimes, hours later, the sound of two people descending, separately, and always. The next morning, the mistress's breakfast untouched, her teacup still full. Harriet began to pray quietly as she worked, her hands kneading dough in rhythm with whispered verses. "Deliver us from the snares of the devil," she murmured. "Deliver this house from what it done, invited in." Jordan, meanwhile, moved like a ghost through Belmont. They spoke only when spoken to, obeyed every instruction with that same measured grace. Yet the eyes, those steady, dark eyes, missed nothing. Thomas avoided meeting them now. At first, he had justified his fascination as study, a pursuit of knowledge, even charity. But the longer Jordan stayed under his roof, the less that fiction held. He began to feel watched not by the slave, but by something in himself reflected back through them. Catherine, for her part, grew thinner. She ate sparingly, her skin taking on a translucent quality, vines-like blue ink beneath fine paper. She spent long hours in her sitting room with Jordan, having them read aloud from the Bible or the novels she once loved. Yet even scripture, when Jordan's calm voice recited it, seemed to shift, meaning, one afternoon, Catherine had them read from the book of Genesis, the story of creation. "And God said, 'Let us make man in our image, after our likeness.'" She stopped them. "After our likeness," she repeated softly. "Not his likeness. Ours." Jordan looked up. "Perhaps God contained both," they said. Catherine's hand trembled. "Then what are we to do with that kind of God?" Jordan's voice was almost a whisper. "Live under him, I suppose, or try to survive him." Catherine turned away quickly. But later, she would remember that line, "survive him," and realize it was the closest thing to prophecy she had ever heard. Down in the quarters, the whispers grew louder. They called Jordan the half-soul, the divided one, the spirit between doors. Some said the master had brought a conjure person into his home, and that the strange storms and failing crops were punishment. "Mark my words," said an older man named Isaac one evening by the fire. "Ain't no good comes from studying what the Lord meant to stay secret. They playing with something too big for white folks' hands, but they got the power." Another replied, "Power don't mean wisdom." Isaac said, Sometimes it just means the devil's using your hand to turn his wheel. The others nodded, falling silent as wind moved through the pines. The plantation seemed to listen with them. Inside the main house, Thomas's journal grew heavier by the night. What had begun as medical notes, measurements, observations was now filled with frantic sketches, not of anatomy, but of eyes, hands, mouths, faces that blurred between forms. He drew the same shape again and again, a body divided down the middle, one half in shadow, the other in light. Catherine found the journal once when he was away. She read the first few pages, then another, then closed it so fast her breath caught. The writing was neat but fevered, words pressed into the paper as if carved, one line repeated over and over in the margins. To understand is to possess. She sat for a long time afterward, staring at the fireplace until her reflection blurred in the glass. Later that evening, she went to Jordan's room and asked a question she could not stop herself from asking. "Do you ever wish you had been born ordinary?" Jordan looked at her. Expression unreadable. "Would that make me free?" "No," Catherine admitted. Then what difference would it make? Their calmness unnerved her more than anger ever could. By October, the house no longer obeyed its seasons. The nights grew cold, but Thomas forgot to order more firewood. The fields waited unharvested as he spent hours locked in his study. The shutters closed tight. Catherine dismissed most of the servants, claiming headaches. The corridors filled with dust. The silver went unpolished. Belmont was decaying quietly, beautifully, like a corpse that refuses to rot all at once. One night, Harriet dared to speak to Jordan. The younger slave had come down to the kitchen for tea, Catherine's latest demand at midnight. Harriet stepped forward, lowering her voice. "Child, I seen what's happening in this house. Ain't right. You need to take care." Jordan paused, meeting her eyes for the first time. "I have everything I need, Aunt Harriet. They treat me well." "That ain't what I asked." Jordan hesitated. For a heartbeat, something pain, perhaps flickered in their gaze. Then it was gone. "It's easier when you don't think about it." The words chilled Harriet more than anything else. She wanted to reach out, to touch the child's arm, to say, "You still got a soul left." But footsteps echoed from above, and Jordan slipped away like smoke. That night, Harriet dreamed of a mirror cracking down the middle. When she woke, she found frost on the window glass, even though the air was warm. From that point forward, the servants began to speak of the third-floor room as if it were a thing alive. They claimed the air near it stayed cold even when the fires below roared hot. Some swore they heard voices through the walls, sometimes laughter, sometimes sobbing, sometimes both at once. Harriet forbade the younger ones from going upstairs alone. "Whatever walks up there," she said, "ain't meant for human company." But it was too late. The contagion had already spread. In the way Thomas's eyes followed Jordan without seeing, in the way Catherine's voice trembled when she said the name, in the way Jordan's silence became a mirror so perfect that everyone who looked into it began to see themselves stripped bare. Belmont had begun to rot from the inside, and no one master, mistress, or slave could say exactly when the decay had started. Perhaps with the ledger, perhaps with a glance, perhaps long before either of them was born. What mattered was that now, the house itself seemed to breathe differently, as though some new presence had settled into its walls, a quiet, patient thing that only asked to be noticed. And soon, everyone would. Winter came early that year. Frost crept down the window panes of Belmont before the 1st of November, whispering against the glass like something trying to get in, or perhaps something trying to get out. The plantation seemed to exhale its last warmth with the tobacco harvest. Even the crows abandoned the fields. Inside, the house existed in two temperatures. Downstairs, the hearths burned steady, filling the air with the smell of oak and smoke. Upstairs, on the third floor, the air stayed cold, heavy, and motionless. The servants avoided that corridor, moving past it quickly, eyes averted. They said the cold wasn't from weather. It came from something else, the kind of chill that settles over a place where God has stopped looking. Catherine barely noticed the change. She lived now in a quiet fever, her days divided between restless fascination and deep exhaustion. She spent hours with Jordan, not speaking, only watching. Sometimes she would order them to sit by the window so she could paint, though she never finished a single canvas. She'd study their face, then stop halfway through, hands trembling, as if afraid the act of capturing that likeness would reveal something she wasn't ready to know. "Hold still," she would whisper. "I am still, mistress." "No," Catherine said once, voice breaking. "You're never still. Even when you don't move, you change." Jordan said nothing. They simply met her gaze for one heartbeat too long. And Catherine turned away, shaken by what she saw reflected there, not defiance, not submission, but comprehension. Thomas filled the nights with his own ritual. He had moved his desk near the fire and surrounded himself with books, treatises on human anatomy, medical reports from Europe, papers describing what he called rare formations. He no longer joined Catherine for dinner. He claimed the work was for science, for posterity, that one day scholars would thank him, but his handwriting betrayed him. The once precise script had turned feverish, looping over itself. The journal had stopped recording facts weeks ago and begun recording hallucinations, dreams of flesh and symmetry, of the divine trapped in contradiction. God made Adam and Eve, he scrawled one night. But what if the perfection was before the separation? He stared at that line for hours, then crossed it out until the paper tore. Harriet, from her watch in the kitchen, saw what others refused to. The master no longer slept. His boots left new prints at dawn, where no man had reason to walk the path between the main house and the old garden cottage. The mistress's hair had begun to fall in clumps when she brushed it, though she smiled when people noticed. "Just winter dryness," she would say, but Harriet knew sickness when she saw it. And this was the kind that no doctor could cure. One afternoon, when Catherine's headache had confined her to bed, Harriet dared to bring food up to Jordan's room. The young slave sat by the window, pale light tracing the edges of their face. The air smelled faintly of lavender and candle smoke. "Eat something," Harriet said softly, setting down a tray. "I'm not hungry. I didn't ask if you were hungry. I said eat." Jordan looked up then, truly looked eyes sharp, aware, but hollow. "Do you believe people can be cursed?" "Aunt Harriet." Harriet crossed her arms. "I believe some curses are just people pretending they ain't done wrong." Jordan nodded slowly, gaze dropping to their hands. "Then this house is cursed, because everyone in it keeps pretending." The words were said so gently that Harriet almost missed the weight behind them. She left without answering, her hands shaking. As the cold deepened, Catherine's fascination became methodical. She began dressing Jordan in different garments each day, sometimes in lace, sometimes in rough linen, sometimes in her late father's waistcoat. She studied the effect in the mirror, murmuring to herself like a scholar at an experiment. "It changes nothing," Jordan said once. Catherine looked startled. "What do you mean, the clothes?" "The names. It's still the same body, the same captivity." Catherine's breath hitched. "Do you hate me for this?" Jordan hesitated. "No, mistress. Hate requires freedom." That sentence lingered long after Jordan left the room. Catherine sat alone for hours, staring at the mirror, repeating the words under her breath until they lost meaning. Outside, frost silvered the fields. The overseer complained that the tobacco barns leaked, that the mules were underfed. Thomas barely listened. The books absorbed him now, pages describing the dual nature of the human form, drawings of bodies dissected and labeled by men who believed knowledge could absolve cruelty. He copied the sketches with obsessive care, though his own versions always turned darker, faces half erased, limbs merging into one another. Catherine found one of his drawings by accident. It showed Jordan reclining, half shrouded in shadow, half in light, eyes open but unreadable. Her first instinct was revulsion. Her second was something closer to envy. The skill was crude, but the resemblance undeniable. She tore the page, then hid the pieces in the drawer of her dressing table. That night, she dreamed of standing before a mirror, and seeing not her own face, but Jordan's calm, detached, endless. She woke with her heart racing and went to the window. Down below, through the fog, she saw the faint flicker of a lamp in the cottage, the old valet's house where Jordan had once slept. Thomas's light. He was there again. When he returned hours later, soaked through from the mist, she was waiting in the hall. "Were you with them?" she asked quietly. Thomas froze. "With whom? You know who." He tried to step past her. "Don't start this again." Her voice sharpened. "Then say it. Say their name." "Enough." "Catherine." She laughed. A brittle, hysterical sound. "You can't, because you don't know what they are or what they've made of you." For a moment, Thomas thought she might strike him. Instead, she turned and fled upstairs. The echo of her footsteps sounded like nails being driven into wood. From that night on, something invisible shifted in the house. Catherine stopped attending to Jordan altogether. Yet she couldn't stay away. Thomas avoided the third floor, but couldn't bring himself to bar the door. Jordan continued to serve both, quietly, efficiently, as if unaware of the tension coiling around them, but in their eyes, a new intelligence had begun to glimmer. They understood. They had always understood. Harriet told the others to keep their distance. "Whatever's in that room," she warned, "it's hungry, and it ain't ever full." In December, the frost broke into sleet. The roof groaned under its own weight. Inside Belmont, Thomas sat in his study surrounded by journals that no longer held meaning. The ink had faded, his own words blurring together until they resembled scripture written by a mad priest. "The body is a door. The door must be opened." He barely noticed the draft that slipped under the door, carrying the faintest trace of lavender and candle wax. Nor did he hear the soft steps behind him until a voice said, "You'll find nothing in those pages, Master." He turned. Jordan stood in the doorway, calm, composed, a presence both fragile and immovable. "You speak out of turn," Thomas said, though his voice lacked conviction. Jordan stepped closer. "I only speak truth. You look for meaning in my body, but what you see is yourself. You call it study. I call it confession." The words sliced deeper than any whip. Thomas's breath caught, but anger was impossible. What he felt instead was terror, the terror of seeing himself through the eyes of the thing he thought he owned. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Jordan turned and left, the door closing softly behind them. The study felt colder than before. That night, Catherine dreamed again. The same mirror, the same face, not her own. But this time, when she looked closer, the reflection smiled. Downstairs, the clock struck 3. Somewhere on the 3rd floor, a door opened quietly, and the sound of footsteps, 2 sets this time, crossed the wooden floorboards. By morning, the frost on the window had melted into long streaks, like tears that had frozen before they could fall. Belmont had passed the point of return. The first frost of January brought with it a silence so deep it felt alive, the kind that seeps into the wood and lingers in the lungs. Belmont was no longer a home, it was an echo chamber where every thought, every breath, every regret hung suspended in the air. To the outsiders, neighboring planters, the minister from Christchurch, Thomas and Catherine, were merely unwell. Their servants were said to have grown lazy, their fields neglected. Yet the truth inside those brick walls was far more insidious. The house had turned inward on itself. Every hallway led to the same place upstairs, to the 3rd floor, to the room where something unspeakable waited in the quiet. In the fields, 2 brothers, Samuel and Isaac, tried to run. They slipped away before dawn, carrying nothing but a stolen loaf of bread and a broken compass. When they were caught by patrollers 15 miles away, the overseer brought them back in chains, faces bloodied from the road. Thomas was summoned from his study to pass judgment, though he looked more ghost than man. He stood on the porch as the men were dragged before him. The whip coiled like a serpent at his side. For a moment, he simply stared at them, then gave the order, 10 lashes each. Standard punishment. But his voice lacked conviction, his eyes somewhere far away. The blows landed dull and heavy against the morning fog. When it was done, The two brothers lay shivering in the dirt. Thomas dismissed the crowd with a wave of his hand, then lingered alone beside the whipping post. Harriet watched from the kitchen window. She saw his shoulders trembling, not with rage, but with something like sickness. When he turned to go, his face was wet, though it was not raining. That night, she knelt beside her cot and whispered into the dark, "Lord, if you mean to punish this place, do it quick. Don't let the innocent suffer for the sins of the house." Upstairs, on the third floor, the mistress and her servant had become inseparable once more. Catherine no longer summoned Jordan with words. They appeared when she needed them, as if answering a thought. The room had grown strange, half parlor, half shrine, curtains drawn, mirrors covered, a single candle always burning low. Catherine would speak endlessly, rambling about her childhood in Richmond, the stillborn son, her father's empty mercies, her husband's silences. Jordan listened without reaction, their calm face an invitation and a mirror all at once. "You don't judge me," Catherine said one afternoon, her hands twisting the fabric of her gown. "It isn't my place." Jordan replied, "Then whose place is it? God's?" "Perhaps, though I've yet to see him here." Catherine looked up sharply. "Don't say that." "Then where is he?" "Mistress, in your husband's books, in this room, if he was ever here. He's turned his face away." Catherine slapped them. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the small room. Jordan didn't move. They only blinked once. Slowly. Moments later, Catherine began to sob. "I'm sorry. I don't know what's happening to me." Jordan touched their own cheek where her hand had struck. "You're becoming what you've always been. You just finally see it." The words cut deep enough to leave silence behind. That evening, thunder rolled across the horizon, though no storm followed. Thomas sat in his study, staring into the fire, a half-empty glass beside him. He could feel the tension in the air like a rope pulled too tight. Somewhere above him, he heard Catherine's laughter, low, hysterical, edged with despair. He closed his eyes. The laughter stopped. Then came footsteps. 2 sets. One heavier, one light. He could tell which belonged to which. The fire hissed as he poured whiskey onto the logs. "God forgive me," he muttered, but the words sounded empty. By morning, the servants knew to avoid the master. His temper had grown unpredictable. He shouted at the overseer for trivial mistakes, then apologized minutes later. His eyes were ringed dark, his hands trembling from lack of sleep. He walked the corridors like a man haunted by the very air he breathed. Harriet tried once more to speak to him. She found him in his study at dusk, surrounded by the smell of old books and unwashed clothes. "Master Rutledge," she said softly, "you ain't been right for weeks. Whatever's happening upstairs, it's killing this house. You got to end it." He looked up slowly, as if hearing her from a great distance. "End it," he repeated. "Do you think it can be ended?" "Yes." "See, sell that one. Send them away. Start clean." For a moment, she thought he might listen, but then his eyes sharpened with a strange, almost childlike fear. "You don't understand," he whispered. "If I send Jordan away, what will become of me?" Harriet's stomach turned. There was no reason left to reach. She bowed her head and left him there, knowing she had just spoken to a man already half dead. That night, wind tore through the trees. The lamp flames flickered and went out one by one, until only the upstairs candle burned a small orange pulse in the heart of the dark. Catherine was awake. Sitting by the window, Jordan stood behind her, brushing her hair. Outside, lightning flashed briefly, illuminating their reflections in the glass, mistress and servant, almost identical in outline. "I feel like I'm disappearing," Catherine murmured. "Maybe you're becoming something else. Something better, something truer." Jordan said. Catherine closed her eyes. "And you, what are you becoming?" Jordan's hand paused mid-stroke. "Nothing," they said softly. "I've always been nothing." The mistress turned, reaching up to touch their face, and for the briefest instant, Jordan allowed it. Skin to skin, warmth to warmth, then footsteps sounded in the hallway. Thomas's voice, distant but unmistakable. Catherine. The candle wavered. Catherine pulled her hand away. Go, she whispered. Jordan stepped back, vanishing into the shadows just as Thomas entered. He looked around the dim room, eyes bloodshot, clothes wrinkled. Who were you speaking to? No one. He glanced at the candle, then at the empty corner where Jordan had stood moments before. No one. Catherine smiled faintly. You've always hated my conversations with no one, haven't you? Thomas's face hardened. You're unwell. We both are, she said. Only difference is I admit it. He left without replying, but that night, as rain began to fall again, both of them lay awake separate, silent, waiting for something neither could name but both knew was coming. In the quarters, Harriet couldn't sleep either. The wind carried the faintest sound from the big house, not words, not cries, but the steady rhythm of someone walking the floor above, pacing endlessly between one door and another. She crossed herself and whispered to the dark, "It's coming soon." And she was right, because in the upper hallway, behind a door that never quite shut, Jordan was awake too, sitting in the candlelight, hands folded, listening to the breathing of two people destroying themselves, one heartbeat at a time. They knew the pattern. They knew how this kind of story ended. And they knew, though they did not yet understand, that the ending had already begun. Dr. Edmund Carlyle arrived at Belmont Estate on a grey December afternoon, the sky low and colourless, the fields crusted with frost. His carriage wheels crunched over the frozen dirt, echoing through the hollow spaces of the property. The doctor had not been summoned. He came because the rumours had reached Richmond before the winter snows. The whispers were vague, something about Thomas Ruttle's declining health, about his wife's strange seclusion, about a new house servant whose nature was not easily spoken of. Carlyle, who had known Thomas's father, decided that old obligations outweighed propriety. When Thomas greeted him at the door, the doctor almost didn't recognize the man. The proud, carefully groomed planter he remembered was gone, replaced by a pale figure with hollow cheeks and a beard grown uneven. His clothes hung loose, his collar askew. The eyes, once steady and commanding, darted like a hunted animal's bows. "Edmund," Thomas said, his voice too bright, "you've come a long way. I wasn't expecting I was in Farmville." Carlyle lied kindly and thought I'd call upon an old friend. They shook hands. Thomas's fingers were cold as bone. Inside, the house was colder still. Fires burned, yet gave no warmth. Carlyle felt it instantly, the heavy stillness that clings to houses where something unsaid has begun to rot. Catherine did not appear for the doctor's arrival, though her footsteps echoed faintly above them. Thomas poured whiskey and spoke with the eagerness of a man desperate to sound normal. They discussed crops, debt, the growing tension in the country. Then, as if unable to resist, Thomas shifted the topic. "You still take an interest in anatomy, I believe?" he asked casually. Carlyle hesitated. "To the degree my profession requires. I have someone you should see. A singular example of nature's anomalies." The tone in his voice made Carlyle set his glass down. "Thomas," he said gently, "you sound as if you've turned your home into a laboratory." A thin smile. "In a way, perhaps I have." That evening, Thomas insisted they dine together. The table that once hosted 20 sat only 2. Dust dulled the silver, and the candlelight made everything flicker at the edges. As though the house itself were trying to dissolve, Thomas spoke with a strange, fevered excitement. He described the specimen he had purchased, a hermaphrodite of remarkable symmetry, educated, docile, possessing qualities both male and female. He spoke of medical curiosity, of divine design, of perfection untainted by human division. Carlyle listened, his expression tightening as the words grew faster, less coherent. The language of science had slipped into obsession. Finally, Thomas said, "I'd like your opinion, as a physician, on the condition." Carlyle hesitated. "If this is about a human being, not a medical artifact, you understand there are limits to." "I understand," Thomas interrupted sharply. "But I must show you." They climbed the stairs together, the steps groaning beneath them. At the third-floor landing, the air changed colder, denser, touched by something unseen. The corridor smelled faintly of lavender and candle smoke. Thomas paused outside a door and turned the key. "Prepare yourself," he said. The room was small and dimly lit, curtains drawn tight, a single lamp burning on the table. Catherine sat near the window, her face pale, her eyes fever-bright. She looked not at the men, but at the figure standing quietly by the bed. "This is Jordan," Thomas said, his voice low, almost reverent. Cariel blinked, uncertain what he expected. The person before him was neither monstrous nor divine, only human, delicate and self-contained, with an expression of practiced stillness. They bowed their heads slightly. "Good evening, Doctor." The voice was melodic, balanced on that fine edge between registers. It startled Cariel with its calm dignity. Thomas gestured impatiently. "Examine them. You'll see." "Mr. Ruttled, please." Cariel turned to Jordan. "Would you permit me a brief examination?" Jordan nodded. "As you wish." What followed was quiet, professional, almost reverent. Cariel took the pulse, asked questions, observed posture, features, hands. He noted what Thomas had described, but his manner remained respectful, not clinical. When he finished, he stepped back, his brow furrowed. "Remarkable," he said softly. "And yet this is a person. Thomas, not a specimen." Thomas's eyes flared. "A phenomenon. Edmund, a marvel of creation, proof of something higher than us." Catherine laughed suddenly, a brittle, broken sound. "Higher, you've dragged heaven into this madness." "Enough, Catherine." But she rose from her chair, her voice shaking. "Tell him what you've done. Thomas, tell him about the nights you spend in this room, writing your holy notes. Tell him how you look at this child and think you're studying God when you're only studying your own ruin." "Catherine, don't shout at me," she snapped. "He should know what kind of sickness has taken root in this house." The silence that followed was unbearable. Cariel cleared his throat. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "we should speak privately." In the study, with brandy in their hands and the fire crackling low, Cariel tried to find the right words. "I mean no disrespect," he began, "but you are ill. Thomas, you and your wife both. This fixation, it's consuming you. Whatever that servant represents to you, it's not knowledge, it's despair given form." Thomas stared into the fire. "You don't understand." "I understand enough. You've turned a human being into a mirror, and you can't stand what you see reflected. Don't lecture me. Edmund, you've never known emptiness." "I've known sin," Cariel said softly, "and I know the look of a man trying to sanctify it." Thomas's face twisted. "You call me a sinner for wanting to understand. I call you lost," Cariel said simply. For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of the mantel clock. Then Thomas rose abruptly, his movements sharp. "You've seen what I wished you to see. That will be all." Cariel sighed. "Thomas, listen to me. Whatever lives in that room will destroy you if you let it. End this. Send the servant away. Save what's left of your wife. Your name, your soul." Thomas didn't answer. He stood by the window, staring out at the frost-blurred fields. "You speak as though I still have a choice." Cariel left before dawn. Snow had begun to fall. As his carriage rolled away, he looked back at Belmont once. A grey silhouette against the white sky. The house looked less like a dwelling than a mausoleum. In Richmond, he would consider writing to the magistrate or to the church. But what would he say? That a man had gone mad over a slave. That obsession had become religion in that house. No law forbade madness. And so he did nothing. Inside Belmont, Thomas watched the carriage disappear into the mist. His reflection in the glass looked like a stranger. Behind him, Catherine's footsteps approached, soft but steady. "What did he tell you?" she asked. Thomas turned slowly. "That I'm damned." Catherine gave a hollow laugh. "Then at least he's observant." "Do you think we're damned?" Catherine, her expression softened for a fleeting moment. "We're worse than damned." Thomas, "The damned still believe in God." She walked away before he could answer. That night, the frost deepened. Somewhere in the house, a door creaked open. Jordan's voice drifted softly through the corridor, a single line of a hymn once forbidden in the quarters. Steal away home." In the silence that followed, Thomas whispered into the darkness, "If only it were that simple." And Belmont held its breath, waiting for the next breaking point. By January, Belmont had gone silent except for the wind. It screamed through the chimneys at night like something alive, and the servants swore they heard voices inside it pleading, whispering, warning. Snow lay thick over the fields, turning the ruined plantation into a white shroud. The world outside the house had gone still. Inside, it was coming apart. For nearly 3 weeks, no visitors came. The road to Farmville was impassable, and the overseer had taken sick and never returned. The last delivery wagon left without payment and without words. Those who worked the quarters stayed close to their fires, sensing that something unholy had fastened itself to the big house and was feeding on what little life remained inside. Thomas had stopped pretending to manage anything. His desk was a chaos of unopened letters, unpaid accounts, and empty bottles. He hardly ate. He rarely spoke. The few times Harriet saw him, his shirt was buttoned wrong, his hands shaking so violently that he could not pour a drink without spilling half of it. When he did speak, it was in fragments. "There's no sin," he muttered once, staring into the hearth. "There's only design." Harriet crossed herself quietly and slipped away before he could notice her. She'd stopped trying to reason with him. Reason had left Belmont months ago. Catherine no longer left the 3rd floor. She'd turned her sitting room into a sanctum of obsession, candles burned at all hours. Curtain drawn, the smell of wax and sickness mingling in the air. Her hair hung loose and unwashed, her face pale as paper. Jordan remained there too. As constant as a shadow, they moved quietly, tending to Catherine's needs with that same eerie composure. Sometimes Catherine talked for hours, sometimes she said nothing at all. On one such afternoon, as the snow fell thick outside the window, Catherine whispered, "Do you believe souls can rot?" Jordan looked up from folding linens. "Souls, yes, like fruit left too long on the branch. I don't know." "Mistress," Jordan said softly, "I think the soul isn't the part that rots. It's the part that watches." Catherine turned her face away, tears gathering without falling. "Then mine has watched too much." At night, the house echoed with strange noises, the creak of footsteps, the slow opening and closing of doors that no one had touched. Sometimes, from her bed, Harriet heard weeping above her head, sometimes laughter. Once, she swore she heard the faint strain of a hymn, the same one Jordan had sung weeks earlier, but warped, drawn out, like the melody of a dying thing. No one dared go upstairs after dark. Thomas wandered those nights. The snow muffled the world, and the silence became intoxicating. He drifted from room to room with a candle, pausing sometimes to touch the walls as though feeling for a heartbeat in the wood. He could not tell whether he was awake or dreaming. One night, he stopped outside the 3rd floor door. He could hear Catherine's low murmur, the scrape of a chair, Jordan's soft reply, the sound of 2 lives wound together in a rhythm that excluded him completely. He knocked once. The voices stopped. When Catherine opened the door, she looked like she'd been carved from wax. Her eyes gleamed feverishly. "You shouldn't come here," she said. "It's my house." "Not anymore." He pushed past her. The air inside the room was warm and strange, thick with candle smoke and the faint scent of lavender. Jordan stood by the window, motionless, eyes lowered. Thomas's gaze lingered on them, then turned to his wife. "You think this is holiness," he said quietly. "You think your suffering redeems you, but this is filth." Catherine laughed, a dry sound, And what would you know of redemption? You started this. Thomas took a step closer. You're destroying yourself. She met his eyes. Then at least I'm doing it honestly. He raised a hand, as if to strike her, but stopped midway. Jordan stepped between them. Calm, unmoving. Don't, they said, simply. For a moment, Thomas could see his own reflection in Jordan's eyes, wild. Disperate. Hollow. Then he turned and left, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the house like the crack of something breaking for good. 2 days later, the snow turned to freezing rain. Roof beams moaned under the weight of ice. Harriet moved through the house with buckets to catch the drips, muttering prayers under her breath. The servants were restless now, whispering about leaving altogether once the roads cleared. That night, as thunder rolled in the distance, Harriet gathered her courage and climbed the stairs. She found Thomas in his study. The fire burned down to ash, the air reeking of whiskey. Master rattled, she said quietly. He didn't look up. I need to speak plain. That thing upstairs, it's killing all of you. You got to end it. Sire, before it ends you. Thomas's head lifted slowly, his eyes unfocused. You think it can be ended? I think you can send that child away. Start again. He gave a dry laugh. Start again, Harriet. I've passed the point of starting. There's only ending now. Then let it end without blood, she pleaded. He stared at her for a long moment. Then his shoulders slumped. Get out, he whispered. She did, but she knew the moment she closed the door that something irreversible had just been spoken into being. In the following days, the atmosphere in the house grew unbearable. The air felt charged, waiting for a storm that refused to break. Catherine moved like a sleepwalker, pale and weightless, her eyes fixed on some point no one else could see. Thomas spent most of his time in the study, writing letters he never sent, then burning them in the grate. Jordan did their duties with quiet precision, speaking less each day. Harriet caught sight of them once in the hallway, carrying a tray of water to Catherine's room. Their expression was calm, but their hands shook. That night, a fierce wind tore through the valley. The shutters banged open and shut, and the house seemed to groan. Somewhere in the storm, a window shattered. Harriet heard a single cry from upstairs, short, sharp, and cut off before it could become a scream. Then silence. She ran halfway up the stairs before stopping. She couldn't make herself go farther. She stood there in the dark, hand gripping the banister, listening to the house breathe. After a moment, she whispered, "It's begun." And indeed it had, because by morning, the wind had died, but the house felt lighter, emptier, as though it had surrendered something. Catherine's room was locked from the inside. The servants would not open it. Thomas gave no orders. He sat at his desk staring at the fire, lips moving in silent prayer or maybe an apology. Outside, the ice began to thaw, dripping slowly from the eaves like tears. The world seemed to hold its breath. The storm was over, but what it had loosened would not be contained much longer. The 14th of February, Itembabewushar, a date that would later appear in no record, on no grave, yet would stain everything that followed. Morning arrived without light. A grey drizzle hung in the air, turning the gardens into black mud. The house was still. Even the crows seemed to avoid it. Inside, the walls sweated with moisture. Every sound, footsteps, whispered words. The scrape of cutlery carried as though the house itself were listening. Catherine woke early. She had not truly slept in days. The mirror across the room reflected a stranger's sunken eyes. Lips cracked, hair loose and tangled. There was a peculiar calm to her movements as she dressed. She chose a dark blue gown, plain and heavy, as though preparing for a journey that required solemnity. On her desk lay a folded scrap of paper, her father's Bible verse written in her own hand, "All have sinned and come short of the glory of God." She read it once, then tucked it into her sleeve. Downstairs, Harriet was lighting the morning fire when she heard Catherine's steps overhead. They were slow, measured, deliberate. The sound made the hairs on her arms rise. She turned to Delia, the maid beside her. "Go to the quarters after breakfast," she whispered. "Take the children. Don't come back till sundown." "Why?" "Aunt Harriet. Because today feels like judgment." By midday, the drizzle turned to rain. Thomas sat in his study, unshaven, staring at the fire as it hissed. He hadn't eaten. Beside him lay the pistol, his father's dueling piece, kept loaded since the rebellion rumors years earlier. He told himself it was for protection, though he no longer remembered from whom. On the third floor, Catherine and Jordan sat opposite each other, the room lit by a single lamp. The curtains were drawn. Outside, the thunder rumbled distantly, echoing through the fields. "I can't do this anymore," Catherine said suddenly. Her voice sounded clearer than it had in months. Jordan looked at her, eyes calm but weary. "Do what?" "Mistress, wake up. Breathe. Pretend I'm still one of them. You can leave." Catherine laughed softly. "Leave? There's nowhere left to go. Not after what I've done. Not after what we've all done." She stood, pacing the room. Her hands trembled. "I thought I could understand you, Jordan. That if I could name what you are, I'd understand what's missing in me. But it's all confusion. You're not the sickness. You're the mirror." Jordan's voice was gentle, then stopped looking. "I can't." She moved to the dresser and pulled open the drawer. Inside, wrapped in a kerchief, was the pistol. She'd taken it from Thomas's study 2 nights before. The weight of it in her hand was terrifyingly steady. "Put it down," Jordan said softly. "Why? So this can go on. So he can keep rotting in his study, and I can keep rotting in this room." Lightning flashed across her face, and for a heartbeat, she looked almost luminous, like a saint carved from marble. Mid-prayer, "You think dying will free you?" Jordan said. "It might free you," she answered. The door burst open. Thomas stood in the doorway, soaked from the rain, eyes wild. "Catherine," he gasped. "What are you doing?" She didn't turn. "Ending it, Thomas, before it ends us." He stepped forward cautiously. "Give me the gun." "Why? So we can go back to pretending. So you can keep telling yourself this is science and not sin, Catherine. Please." Her laughter was strange, soft, almost tender. "Do you remember when we first came here, you said Belmont would be our salvation? But it was only a stage, wasn't it, for your experiments, for my illusion? And Jordan," she turned toward them, "was our audience." Jordan took a step forward. "Mistress, you can stop this. It doesn't have to end here." Catherine's eyes filled with tears. "It already has." For a moment, time seemed suspended. The thunder paused. The rain held its breath. Then she whispered, "I'm sorry," and turned the pistol upward beneath her chin. Thomas Lunget, shouting her name, but the sound of the shot drowned everything. The flash lit the room like lightning. Catherine fell backward, her body striking the floor with a dull, final thud. Blood spread slowly across the boards, dark and gleaming in the lamplight. Thomas dropped to his knees beside her, hands hovering helplessly over her still form. "No, no, no." The words broke apart into a noise that wasn't human. Jordan stood frozen. The gun lay a few feet away, a thin wisp of smoke still curling from the barrel. They looked at Thomas, then at Catherine, and finally at the window, where the rain pressed against the glass like 1,000 ghostly fingers. Downstairs, the servants had heard the shot. Harriet stood motionless in the kitchen doorway, a ladle in her hand, her mouth open but soundless. The house itself seemed to tremble, then fall quiet. Delia whispered, "What was that?" Harriet's voice cracked. "It's finished." But she was wrong. Catherine didn't die immediately. The bullet had torn through her jaw and lodged near the base of her skull, sparing her by some cruel mercy. Thomas carried her to the bed, hands shaking, pressing cloths against the wound. "Stay with me," he whispered over and over, though her eyes were already rolling back. Jordan fetched water, bandages, did what could be done, which was nothing. By the time the local doctor arrived, summoned by a terrified stable boy. Catherine was unconscious and barely breathing. She won't last the night, the doctor said quietly. There's nothing to be done but pray. Thomas sat beside her through the long hours, his head bowed, whispering apologies she couldn't hear. He spoke of the first time they met, of the life he thought he'd build, of the child they lost. His words ran together until they became incoherent murmurs. Jordan stayed in the corner, silent. At dawn, as the first grey light filtered through the curtains, Catherine drew one final shallow breath and was still. Thomas didn't move for a long time. Then he said, very softly, "You did this." At first, Jordan thought he was talking to God, but then his eyes lifted, and the hatred there was almost peaceful. "You brought this into our house. You ruined her. You ruined me." Jordan met his Chaze, unflinching. "No, Master, you ruined yourselves. I was only here to watch." Thomas's face collapsed. He turned back to Catherine and wept until his body shook. The funeral took place 3 days later. Under a grey sky, the neighbors came, polite and curious, whispering their condolences. The official story was an accident. An old pistol misfired while she was cleaning it. No one questioned it. Better an accident than the truth. Suicide carried too many consequences, both legal and spiritual. As the coffin was lowered into the cold ground, Thomas stood stiffly, rain dripping from his hat brim. Jordan, at a distance, watched without expression. Harriet stood beside them, eyes down, whispering, "Rest now, poor child." But the earth did not close easily over Belmont's dead. The wind carried the faint scent of gunpowder for days afterward, and the rooms upstairs stayed cold, no matter how many fires were lit. At night, Thomas walked the halls with the pistol in his hand. Though it was empty now, Jordan still served his meals, still cleaned his study, still existed in the same haunted silence. Neither spoke of what had happened. They didn't need to. The house itself remembered, and somewhere deep within its walls, behind the sealed door and the dried blood beneath the floorboards, a single echo remained, the sound of the shot that had ended one life and condemned another. Belmont would never breathe the same way again. The days following Catherine's burial passed like ghosts, thin, grey, and endless. The house no longer belonged to the living. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the wind through the shutters, felt like a reminder of the thing that had been done and could not be undone. Thomas stopped shaving, stopped eating, stopped pretending there was a reason to continue the routines that had once held his world together. He moved through the rooms like a man trapped in a waking dream, haunted by the memory of his wife's final breath. In the evenings, he would sit by the fire in the study, a glass in his hand, whispering to no one. Sometimes he spoke her name, sometimes he murmured fragments of scripture. Once, Harriet heard him repeat a single phrase over and over, "It's the punishment I earned." The servants had begun to leave in quiet groups. No one dared ask for freedom papers. They simply vanished into the night, leaving their cabins dark and empty. Only Harriet, Delia, and Jordan remained. The silence between them was heavy and necessary. They understood the kind of curse that could linger in a place like this. One night, as the last embers of the fire faded to ash, Thomas rose unsteadily from his chair and crossed the hall. The door to the third-floor room, the room where it had happened, was still shut. He had not been able to bring himself to lock it, nor to open it. He simply stood before it each night, staring at the cracks in the wood as if expecting an answer. That night, however, he turned the handle. The air inside was thick and cold. The scent of iron, of old blood, still clung to the boards, no matter how many times they had been scrubbed. The candle on the dresser had long since melted into a pool of wax. Thomas stepped inside. His boots made soft, hollow sounds on the floor. The spot where Catherine had fallen was still visible, darker than the rest of the wood. He knelt and pressed his hand against it, his breath catching. "Forgive me," he whispered. A sound behind him, a slow intake of breath. He turned. Jordan stood in the doorway, silent, their face unreadable in the moonlight. "You shouldn't be here," they said quietly. Neither should you. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the broken master and the servant who had survived them both. Thomas rose slowly. You think me a monster. I think you were a man. Jordan said, That's worse. He laughed bitterly. Perhaps it is. You know, I thought I bought you because you were an anomaly. Something rare. Something I could study. But it was me who was the anomaly. I thought I understood the world, its rules, and its order, but I didn't understand myself. You still don't. Jordan said nothing. I tried to destroy you, Thomas continued, and in doing so, destroyed everything else. He looked down at the stain again. Tell me, Jordan, what do I do now? Jordan's answer came after a long silence. You live with it. Thomas nodded slowly. I don't think I can. The next morning, Harriet found him asleep at the desk, the pistol beside his hand. She removed it quietly and hid it in the pantry. But she knew it was only a matter of time. There were other guns. The plantation had already begun to die. Fields lay untended. Fences crumbled. Creditors sent letters that went unopened. Rumors spread through the county about the haunted house at Belmont. Some said the mistress's ghost walked the halls. Others said the strange slave, neither man nor woman, had cursed the place with their presence. No one dared buy tobacco from Belmont anymore. No one came to call. By late March, Thomas announced his decision. I'm selling the estate, he told Harriet. His voice was calm, almost kind. There's nothing left to save. Harriet bowed her head. Yes, sire. He sold most of the enslaved people with the property families torn apart overnight, sent to different plantations across the county. He kept only 3, Harriet, old Samuel the stable hand, and Jordan. When asked why he refused to sell the Hermaphrodite slave, Thomas offered no explanation. Perhaps he still needed his witness. On the day the buyers came to inspect the house, Thomas ordered one final task, the ceiling of the 3rd floor room. Board it up. He told the carpenter, no one is to enter again. Write it into the deed if you must. When the hammering began, Harriet wept silently in the kitchen. Every strike of the nail sounded like a heartbeat being buried alive. Within weeks, the sale was done. The papers were signed. Belmont, once 30,000 acres of profit and pride, was gone for a fraction of its worth. That night, Thomas walked through the empty house one last time. The air was heavy with dust and memory. When he reached the front door, he stopped and turned back toward the staircase. Jordan was standing there, watching him. Do you hate me? Thomas asked. Jordan's expression didn't change. Hate is for people who still expect mercy. He nodded, accepting it. I suppose I deserve that. No, Jordan said softly. You deserve to remember. Thomas gave a small, broken smile. That's the crueler sentence. He left Belmont the next morning, taking Jordan and 2 servants with him. They moved to a small house in Lynchburg, modest, quiet, far removed from the life he'd once known. He never attended church again, never joined the county board, never invited anyone to dinner. He and Jordan lived under the same roof, bound by a silence that was neither peace nor reconciliation. They spoke only when necessary, their words stripped of emotion, master and slave by law. But in truth, 2 ghosts inhabiting separate halves of the same ruin. Sometimes, in the stillness of night, Thomas would stand outside Jordan's door, his hand raised as if to knock, but he never did. Inside, Jordan would lie awake, listening to his breathing on the other side of the wood. Neither one could cross that threshold. By November, Thomas's health had collapsed. He died in his sleep at 38, without priest or witness. The attending physician wrote simply heart failure, but those who knew him said it was guilt that stopped his heart before morning. His body was buried beside Catherine's, under the same tree where they'd once picnicked in better days. The tombstone bore no inscription, just the family name, Rutland. Jordan stood at the graveside until the last shovel of dirt fell. Then they turned and walked away, not looking back once. No one knows what became of them after that. The record goes silent. as it so often does for those who were enslaved. Some say they ran north and found freedom. Others whisper they were sold again, vanishing into the machinery of the South. But among the old people of Prince Edward County, a story lingered of a spirit that neither man nor woman could claim, who haunted the ruins of Belmont long after the fires had gone out. When the new owner moved in years later, he found the sealed room just as the contract required. Yet strange things began to happen. Cold drafts even in summer, footsteps in empty halls, and once, late at night, a voice singing soft and low. The words carried from behind the boarded door, steal away home." The merchant sealed the door tighter the next morning, but the sound never truly left the house. By the time the Civil War swept through Virginia, Belmont was abandoned again, and when fire finally consumed it in 1865, the locals said the flames burned blue, as if mixed with saltwater tears. Today, only fragments of brick remain beneath the trees. The land is private. The owners keep the gate locked, but hunters passing through sometimes claim to hear faint singing in the distance, something that doesn't quite belong to a man, nor a woman. And when the wind moves through the ruins, it carries a whisper that sounds almost human. Remember me? When the Civil War ended, Virginia became a graveyard of forgotten estates, but none were spoken of with quite the same mixture of fear and fascination as Belmont. The plantation had vanished into myth, its ruins consumed by vines, its history scrubbed from the county ledgers, but its name lingered like a ghost. By the 1872nd, travelers along the old road near Farmville told of a place where birds would not sing and compasses spun wild. Locals avoided it, saying the ground itself was unsettled. At night, some claimed to see a flicker of light moving among the collapsed foundations, as though someone were still pacing the corridors that no longer existed. A few dared to go closer. One was a Union veteran turned surveyor named Elias Morton, who was sent to map the area for a new railway line. In his journal found years later among his papers in Richmond, he wrote, "The land called Belmont is queer. The air feels charged, as if before a storm. The Negro guides refuse to enter, saying it is a place where no man or woman truly rests. I heard a sound from the old foundation, a voice, low, like a hymn sung through water. The strangest part, it was neither high nor low, neither male nor female. I could not tell which. When I called out, it stopped." Morton left that night and never returned. His report simply marked the area unfit for habitation. By the early 1900s, nothing of the house remained except the foundations, red bricks, moss-covered, half buried under pine and oak. Yet even then, locals claimed the place changed those who lingered too long. Hunters lost their bearings. Campers woke to find their fires extinguished and the sound of soft breathing nearby. Old people said the ground remembered. They said the cries that once echoed within Belmont's walls had soaked into the soil, and that when the wind blew just right, the past rose to the surface. Children dared each other to go near the well, where Thomas Rutland had once thrown the key to the sealed room. They said if you looked into the water at midnight, you wouldn't see your reflection, you'd see someone else. Neither man nor woman, just eyes watching from beneath the surface. For historians, Belmont became a puzzle without answers. County archives from 1850 to 1853 contained a strange gap: no plantation records, no tax filings, no court disputes. It was as though someone had deliberately erased the estate's existence, but letters survived, private ones, scattered across Virginia, hidden in attics, tucked into family Bibles, mentions of the Rutland scandal, of a physician who came back from Farmville pale and trembling, of a slave of unnatural birth who vanished after the mistress's death. One letter, written by Harriet's grandson in 1898, described what she told before she died. The master brought something into that house that weren't meant for this world. He called it Jordan. We just called it sorrow. The mistress went mad trying to understand it. The master followed her into the grave, and that one Jordan walked away like nothing human could do. I saw it with my own eyes, lightning flashed and they were gone, like the light itself took them. Of course, There are simpler explanations. Maybe Jordan fled north, disappeared into the chaos of war, lived out their life under another name. Maybe the story grew in the telling, reshaped by fear and guilt, until myth swallowed, memory whole. But legends persist because they speak to something deeper, the truths we refuse to face. Belmont's story was never just about one family's downfall. It was about the sickness of ownership, the way power distorts love until love becomes hunger. Thomas and Catherine believed they were masters of their world, yet they were only slaves to their desires. And Jordan, born outside every category their society recognized, became the mirror that forced them to see what they truly were. That's why the county sealed the records. Not to hide a crime, but to hide a reflection. In 1961, a small team of archaeologists from the University of Virginia conducted a survey near the old Belmont site. They found the outline of the house's foundations, fragments of porcelain, iron fittings, and a few warped nails. Among the debris was a charred iron key fused to a lump of stone. The team noted it without significance. Locals knew better. They said it was the key, the one meant to stay buried forever. The site was covered again. A new owner fenced it off, posted no trespassing signs that were always replaced when they weathered. No one could say who paid for them. To this day, the land remains private, unmarked on most modern maps. But every few years, someone, usually a curious student or an urban explorer, posts online about finding the ruins. Always the same details. The air feels colder near the center of the foundation. A faint like a voice, can be heard after dusk. Sometimes, if you stand still long enough, it hums your name. One visitor wrote in 2014, "It felt like standing inside a heartbeat, and for a second, I swear I heard someone whisper behind me, 'I'm still here.'" Isa, maybe that's all Belmont ever wanted to be remembered. Not as a haunting, but as a warning. Because history does not die, it hides. It buries itself beneath foundations, behind locked doors, inside the pages someone meant to burn. And every so often, when the world grows quiet enough, it speaks again. If you ever find yourself driving through Prince Edward County on a misty evening and you see an old gate swallowed by vines, don't stop. Don't listen to the singing, no matter how soft it sounds, because some echoes aren't meant to fade. They're meant to remind. Belmont Estate, 1851, 1852. 3 deaths, 1 disappearance, 1 truth that refused to stay buried. And somewhere in the hush between thunder and memory, a voice that still hums through the trees, neither man nor woman, neither slave nor free, whispering the same final words to anyone who dares to listen. Remember me.